Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. This is the second of the Starry Stonewort Collaborative 2020 Summer Webinar Series. My name is David Carr. As you probably know, I'm the project manager for the Starry Stonewort Collaborative. I work with the Finger Lakes Institute at Hobart William Smith Colleges in Geneva, New York. Couple things when we get started here. I think everybody should mute ourselves except Michelle, of course. That way we keep any background noise out and to confuse things. Most people are muting their video as well. I guess that's kind of up to you because Michelle will be sharing her screen. So that's fine. Michelle's with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. She's done all sorts of work and research and studies on Starry Stonewort and control techniques in her part of the world. She is also one of our expert panel for the collaborative. And those folks help guide and advise what we do in the collaborative. And several of the other members are on as well. So I'm very pleased to have them joining us. One other thing, Michelle was very nice to allow us to have her presentation during New York State's Invasive Species Awareness Week. So those of you from New York State, I hope you're partaking in that. I will put up in the chat to everybody a website for our local Finger Lakes PRISM website that has a whole list of different other webinars and things going on for New York's Invasive Species Awareness Week. So there's lots of things going on, so join in. Of course, anybody can join in on those, I think. But of course, it's pointed at New York State. So I guess I'll keep letting people in, but we'll get started. So with that, Michelle, thanks for being here and take it away.
Great, thanks for the introduction, David, and thank you to everyone who tuned in this morning to listen into this webinar. I'm excited to give a webinar to a kind of broader audience. I've spoken to some people in the Midwest a few times, but it's my understanding that this draws in some people from all over the US. So I'm excited to be here today. Next slide. All right, so I'm sure most of you guys have some familiarity with what Starry Stonewort is since you've chosen to attend this webinar this morning. But just a little bit of background for Starry. It's a macroalgae species, so it's different than many of our other aquatic plant species in that it's not a vascular plant. Starry Stonewort is originally native to Europe and parts of Asia. And interestingly, it's quite rare in portions of its native range. It's actually considered endangered in parts of the United Kingdom and Japan. In terms of the United States, our first documented occurrence was in the St. Lawrence River in the 1970s. And it was likely transported to the United States via unintentional dumping of ballast water that came from international sources. Not a lot is really known about the ecology and habitat, but what is known is that it's not a very tall growing species. It tends to grow between 4 to 7 feet tall. Many of our vascular plants can grow quite taller than this. And it doesn't have true roots, but rather has these kind of clear filaments called rhizoids. They look very similar to monofilament fishing line. Starry Stonewort is believed to be a habitat generalist, so it can be found in deep or shallow lakes, bays, or slower moving rivers. And it can also occupy a wide range of water depths, anywhere from very shallow waters, a couple feet, out towards over 40 feet in depth. It tends to prefer sort of calcium-rich, neutral to alkaline waters in kind of that more mesotrophic to eutrophic range. And again, it can really grow in a variety of different substrates, rocky, sandy, and muck. The way that Starry Stonewort reproduces and dispersed is through both fragmentation of the stem, as well as these specialized structures called bulbils. These are white, relatively small, star-shaped, starchy structures, which arise from the main axes as well as the branchlet nodes. One fact that we believe true, at least to date, is that only male starry stonewort plants have been found in the United States to date. And so this basically does not allow for sexual reproduction to be happening between the male and female plants. So the starry stonewort is primarily moving through these bulbils and clonal reproduction. This also adds evidence that the primary way that starry stonewort is being moved around to new lakes is likely human mediated. For example, via boats and trailers and anchors. There's a photo here in this bottom left where there was a tiny starry stonewort bulbul that was attached to this anchor that was being launched in an uninvaded lake. At this time, we don't believe that waterfowl is really a main source of dispersal because these plants aren't sexually reproducing, and these starchy bulbils are not believed to really be able to survive in the gut of a duck as it moves between sites. So the non-native range of starry stonewort has continued to expand since the original discovery in the 1970s. But there was quite a lag time before some of these reports started to come in. The first sort of rush of reports happened in the mid-2000s, where there were several lakes in lower Michigan that realized that plant they had been kind of referring to as supercara was actually starry stonewort. This was followed by other reports in Indiana in 2008, and then more recent reports in Wisconsin in 2014, and then followed by Minnesota in 2015. And so as you can see here from this USGS distribution map, starry stonewort is currently known from several states in the Midwest, as well as in the northeastern US and parts of Canada. I alluded to this kind of time gap between initial discovery and then more recent events. And this is a graph that I borrowed from a recent Aquatin Botany paper written by Dan Larkin and others. And it shows the number of reports of starry stonewort over time. And so we can see that there's actually a significant gap here between the 1980s and the early 2000s. And then since the mid-2000s up until present, the number of confirmed starry stonewort cases has really started to increase. Now, this could very well be due to the fact that we have a lot more people aware of the species and a lot more people out there looking for this species. This graph also shows the number of total reports. Again, these confirmed reports are ones that they have a voucher and it was verified by a taxonomic expert. Although you could see that the number of overall reports may potentially be higher than this. So a lot of my talk today are going to focus on our experiences that we've dealt with starry stonewort in Wisconsin. I've been working for the department since 2006, and so this was a species that was on our radar, but when we found it, nonetheless, it was still a little bit surprising to us. We happened to actually be out doing an aquatic plant survey on a lake in southeastern Wisconsin. Primarily, we were interested in doing some Eurasian water milfoil research. And during that survey, we happened to come across a localized population of starry stonewort, or what we at least believed was starry stonewort. We have a very good working relationship with Dr. Ken Carroll and some others at the New York Botanical Garden. And so he was able to confirm this species and kind of triggered our response actions that you'll see in the next portions of the presentation. And so the first thing that we did once we had our verified population was to coordinate a rapid assessment monitoring, primarily focusing in proximal water bodies around this verified location. And this monitoring really consisted of a variety of techniques. We had staff and volunteers out at boat launches, doing rake tosses and snorkeling. We had other people doing meander surveys. And there were some efforts made to try to prioritize where we were looking in this area of the state based on some factors that we believed would influence starry stonewort, such as whether or not native Cara species were growing and also the water hardness. For those that aren't familiar with Wisconsin, and particularly southeast Wisconsin, most of our lakes fall into this category where they have pretty hard water and they have Cara, so it really didn't limit our search all that much, but we did try to make a little bit of an effort to prioritize. Wisconsin is also pretty fortunate in that we have a relatively robust statewide aquatic invasive species and aquatic plant point intercept survey program going on. And so we already had folks out on the landscape looking for other invasive species and doing aquatic plant monitoring. And so there was a lot of heightened outreach and awareness towards these people who were already out on the landscape, making sure they knew how to identify starry stonewort and how to properly report it to the department if they found it. And so that kind of leads us to where we are currently. The number of inland lakes in Wisconsin has expanded. We now are up to 13 lakes where starry stonewort has been verified. And again, verified means that it has been confirmed not only by the department, by an external external expert as well, taxonomic expert. One of our big findings that kind of shook things up a little bit was in 2006 when we realized that starry stonewort was present all along portions of the course of Green Bay and Lake Michigan. So not only was it invading some of our inland waters, but there was also this very obvious source population with the Great Lakes. Up until last year, most of our lakes had been clustered in the southeastern portion of the state. But as of 2019, we have our first population that's located in a little bit more central Wisconsin. And so what we've decided to do with these lakes is to conduct systematic point intercept surveys on these water bodies where starry stonewort has been verified. In Wisconsin, we use a standardized quantitative point intercept methodology. And this gives us a couple of advantages in that we can collect this data over time within a single lake and look for trends in abundance and frequency. And we can also use this point intercept data to relatively easily look at changes amongst different lakes. The PI method is relatively easy to implement. It usually involves 2 people in a boat. But it allows for some pretty good statistically robust data, and you also get that geolocated information on where in the water body starry stonewort is located at. In addition, we're also collecting data on the native plant community as well. So we're hoping that we can use some of this information to understand how starry stonewort and our starry stonewort management actions might be impacting our native communities. This is just a screenshot of what a point intercept grid might look like. So this is our survey grid for Little Muskego Lake. And then on the right is the initial starry stonewort distribution that we found in 2014. So you can see at that time it was quite localized to one bay of this relatively large lake. And so what does all this data mean when we plot it all on one graph? On the bottom axis here, we have the years, so 2014 being our first discovery up until present. And each of these individual colored lines is a single lake that we've been tracking over time. On the y-axis here is our littoral frequency of occurrence. This is a presence-absence metric that calculates how abundant starry stonewort is within the portion of lake where the plants can grow. And one thing that you might notice here is that we've seen quite a few different patterns in starry stonewort. We have some lakes where starry stonewort is still found at about 0% frequency, and we have other lakes where it's quite abundant, up towards 80% of the littoral zone has starry stonewort. We've seen a couple lakes where the trend over time has more or less linear or perhaps even exponentially increased, while other lakes have remained relatively low with more or less not much spread observed over the course of our study so far. And so our goal here is that we're going to continue to be able to track these lakes over time to better understand how starry stonewort spreads in these systems. On top of that, we're very interested in understanding the management of starry stonewort. So in that previous graph I showed you, some of those lakes were implementing management techniques to try to control starry stonewort, some were not, and some of the different intensities and scales of management varied. And so the second half of this presentation that I'm going to get into is really going to focus on some of these management activities that we've implemented. And, you know, to say it bluntly, we've pretty much tried a little bit of everything. There isn't a lot of literature or other case studies to really lean on to understand what might work out here. And so we've decided to take an approach where we've tried different techniques, but we've also made sure to evaluate them to see if they do work or if they don't work, what might we be able to change to perhaps make them more successful in the future. And so just our list of things we've tried several different chemical treatments. Some of these have been what we just call open water treatments. And then we've also explored the use of an actual physical barrier curtain to help contain that herbicide and algicide on site to try to increase our efficacy. We've also looked into using a water level drawdown to try to control starry stonewort. We have a couple lakes that have experimented with diver-assisted suction harvesting and hand removal. We have at least one lake that have tried to implement dredging. And then we also have a lake we've been monitoring that isn't currently doing any active management. And so this is that same graph that I showed you earlier, but it's separated out a little bit more so you can track an individual lake over time. So again, we have the years at the bottom here and the frequency of starry stonewort on the y-axis. Each individual lake, the black squares indicate the amount of starry stonewort over time. And these vertical dashed lines indicate what management technique that group tried. And so, for example, here we can see in Little Muskego Lake, soon after discovery, they attempted some dash. There was 2 individual events. They then followed that up by an herbicide treatment. And then ultimately they did a drawdown, this green line here. This information is all available in a new fact sheet that the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources has put out. And I've recently shared that with David. So if it isn't already, it will be soon available on the Starry Stonewort Collaborative website. And so what I'd like to do now is just take a couple of these lakes and dive into the details a little bit more on the specifics of what they tried and what the outcomes were following management. I unfortunately probably don't have time to talk about every single lake and every single treatment we've tried, but I tried to pick a couple examples here of varying techniques that we've implemented to try to give a breadth of different experiences and outcomes on what we've tried to date. And so what I'll do next is just go through each of these individual case studies. I probably won't spend a ton of time on them because I do have quite a few examples to get through, but this presentation will be available later afterwards. So some of those details on application rates and dates, you can always get after the presentation if you don't catch them now. So just to get things rolling here, I'll start off with one of our chemical controls we did within a Limno-barrier curtain. This was done out on Green Lake in Washington County, again located in the southeastern portion of the state. This is a relatively small seepage lake, about 70 acres, although it is rather deep, about 37 feet. Starry stonewort was discovered in July of 2016, right near one of the 2 public boat accesses. So you can see in this image here, these kind of green dots are where the starry stonewort was located. And this lake was fortunate in that it fell within the Great Lakes Basin, and they were eligible to work with the department to help apply for some GLRI funding to help support some of the monitoring and control efforts that were implemented out on this water body. And so again, the target here was that there was a localized area of starry stonewort near the public access, and the management goal was to try to apply some herbicide within this limno-barrier curtain to try to increase the amount of time that the plants were exposed to the chemicals in hopes that we might be able to achieve some greater control of starry stonewort and ultimately prevent it from spreading to other portions of the lake. And so there's been 2 of these barrier treatments conducted. The first one was conducted in fall of 2018. And then a little more recently, there was a second barrier treatment conducted in the same location in June of 2019. This barrier area was approximately 1 acre. And the herbicides that they chose to use was Cutrine ultra, which is a copper-based herbicide, as well as hydrothol 191, which is an endothol compound. As I mentioned earlier, one of the things that we strive to do with these treatments is to really quantitative evaluate. And so we did 2 different evaluation metrics out here. The first is that we actually collected water samples following application in order to understand how much herbicide was present in the water. And so we did that in both 2018 and 2019 at various hours after treatment. And we had these analyzed at our Wisconsin State Lab of Hygiene to understand how much copper and endothol were in the water at various time points after the application. And then we coupled this with some aquatic plant point intercept monitoring. We collected pre-treatment data within this area and then several post-treatment sub-PI surveys to understand whether or not our management actions were being successful. And as I mentioned earlier, we've also been conducting these broad-scale lake-wide surveys annually as well. And so diving into the results a little bit here, you'll see a series of these graphs, and so I'll try to get you familiar with one or two of them. And so at the bottom here, you have the hours after treatment. In this case, we're going up to 24 hours after treatment. And then on the y-axis, we have the concentration of herbicide that was actually detected in the water. This red dashed line indicates what our target concentration was, so what we were aiming to achieve. And each of these colors is an individual site that we were monitoring. And so the take home from this graph for 2018 and 2019 is that we were fairly good about hitting our target rate. So most of these sites that you can see here are at or near this red line here. And out towards 24 hours after treatment, we still observed quite a fair amount of herbicide. In 2019, we added a survey location outside of this barrier, this GL4 location. And we can see here that the barrier was effective in not allowing that herbicide to really leach out or escape into the areas that we weren't necessarily targeting treatment. This is that same exact image, except the bottom x-axis now goes out to 9 days after treatment instead of just 1 day. And we can again see that we see a pretty nice curve here of that herbicide product staying within that treatment location, and again, not dissipating outside of that barrier. And so this added some evidence that that barrier curtain really helped us in keeping that product on site where we wanted it to be, to try to increase our efficacy as much as possible. We also mentioned endothol, and again, we saw very similar patterns in the endothol concentrations as we did in our copper concentrations. And so what does this mean as far as what we saw for aquatic plant control? Again, just to orientate ourselves with these figures here, we have both 2018 and 2019 data. The blue line here is the presence absence data. So this is our Starry Stonewort frequency of occurrence within the barrier curtain. This red dashed line indicates when the herbicide treatment happened. And then these green bars indicate a metric that we use called our rake fullness rating. It's a semi-quantitative metric that gets at the abundance of Starry Stonewort. And so we'll see here in August 2018, when we compared that pre and post treatment, we actually saw no change at all in Starry Stonewort frequency. If anything, it went up just a little bit. However, we did see some slight decline in our rake fullness. We can't necessarily understand if this was attributed perhaps to the herbicide treatment itself, or if this might just be due to the phenology of this plant and how it tends to naturally senesce later in the season. Looking at 2019, the amount of Starry Stonewort that was out there prior to treatment was actually very low. After the treatment occurred, it did decrease. We didn't find any. However, 1 month after that, it shot back up to over 35%. Which again indicates that unfortunately this treatment wasn't very effective in achieving our goal of reducing Starry Stonewort in these areas. Okay, so that's our experiences with Green Lake, and then I'm going to transition now to a similar case study that we did out on Lake Geneva in Walworth County. Again, this is a similar scenario where there was a small portion of the lake that had Starry Stonewort verified in a lagoon. This lagoon is almost impossible to see on this map. I drew a little arrow here. So Lake Geneva is a very large lake. It's over 5,000 acres. And it was thought, at least to begin with, that Starry Stonewort was just present in this lagoon. And so we worked again with the Lake Association to provide some rapid response grant dollars to help support some monitoring and control efforts in this area. And this is just a picture of that lagoon and that barrier curtain with Lake Geneva proper in the background. So the first chemical treatment occurred in this small lagoon on mid-June of 2019. Again, they used a similar copper and hydrothol combination, and they used this Limno-barrier to help restrict that water movement to the main lake and keep that product in the area they wanted it to be. We also coupled this similarly to Green Lake with both herbicide concentration monitoring and pre and post point intercept surveys. Here are the results from our concentration monitoring from the first treatment that happened in June. It looks like our ability to hit the target concentration, we actually got a little bit higher than we were hoping for in the first day or so after treatment. And then the amount of time that product was there was actually significantly shorter than we saw in Green Lake. By 3 days after treatment, that product wasn't really detectable anymore. It also looks like we were actually undershot our ability to hit our copper target as well. The second treatment that occurred, again within the same lagoon, happened in September. This used a slightly different herbicide concentrate or combination. It used, again, copper, Q-Trine Plus, but combined that with a product known as Clipper. The active ingredient is flumioxacin. In this instance, they did not use the Limno-barrier curtain, but we did do similar pre and post monitoring and herbicide concentration monitoring. Again, it does not look like we were very able to hit our target rate successfully. We were actually well under what we were helping to achieve in terms of the copper concentration. And then the associated aquatic plant data also, unfortunately, wasn't too encouraging. Before the first treatment, we had about 50% of our sites with Starry Stonewort. Following that treatment, we detected Starry Stonewort at about 90% of the locations. That second treatment appears to perhaps have, maybe reduced Starry Stonewort by a small amount. Although it was very difficult for us to determine this late in the season whether or not this kind of brownish black Starry Stonewort material was viable, was it senescing, was it impacted by the herbicide? And so hopefully we'll be able to get out here at some point in 2020 to collect some more information to better understand whether or not this treatment had any long-term impacts, or if it unfortunately wasn't very successful as well. Okay, and then I believe the last herbicide lake that I'm going to talk about is Wind Lake in Racine County. Again, this is a fairly large lake, over 900 acres in southeast Wisconsin. Starry Stonewort was first discovered in August of 2017. And initially, it was believed to be fairly isolated. There was several kind of small patches that were found, and they quickly treated those patches with the idea that they were going to hopefully prevent it from spreading to other areas in the lake. Later in August, they did a more systematic survey, and they found that the amount of Starry Stonewort was actually much more widespread than they initially believed. It was in a relatively large area, but at the same time, it was also relatively localized. So you can see on this map here, there was this kind of core area in this black square here, where most of Starry Stonewort was present, and it was not really found in other portions of the lake yet. And so the treatment goal here was to attempt to apply herbicide to this kind of large semi-established population in order to hopefully prevent Starry Stonewort from spreading to other areas of the lake. And so there was 2 treatments that happened in 2018. The first happened in mid-June. And again, this used a combination of copper and hydrothol. And then a follow-up treatment happened in late July using that same combination. After these kind of large block treatments, there was a little bit of localized navigation channel treatments for Starry Stonewort, but for more or less, they really haven't done much for management following these two large-scale events. Similar to these other lakes that I just talked about, we wanted to do our herbicide concentration monitoring, as well as our pre and post plant monitoring. In this instance, we had 5 locations where we monitored herbicides within the immediate treatment area. And then we had another 5 or 6 locations in other areas of the lake to try to understand, was that herbicide product moving to other portions where we weren't necessarily wanting to control plants. So here is the data for the 5 sites that are located within that main treatment area. This is for copper. And we'll see here that at least in part of our 50-acre plot, we were pretty successful in reaching that target concentration. But there were also parts of the plot, such as this WL1 here, where really we didn't see much product at all. And so even though we were monitoring in the hours after treatment here, it's very possible that wind or water movement started to very quickly move this product off of site soon after application. And this actually adds a little evidence that that might have indeed happened. This graph is looking at those 6 locations outside of our immediate treatment area. And you'll notice here, this blue line WL6, directly to the north of our main treatment area, did experience somewhat of a pulse of herbicide soon after application. And so it's very possible that a prevailing wind or water movement moved some of this herbicide off of site, since there was no barrier preventing it from doing such. These are those same figures, except now instead of copper, we're looking at endothol. Again, pretty close to hitting the concentration for endothol, although not quite. And we see similar patterns where some of these locations, such as this WL4, really just never were exposed to herbicide at all during this treatment. And then I like to kind of compare what we saw in Wind Lake to what we saw in Green Lake, which I talked about a little bit earlier. Wind Lake was treating a very large 50-acre area, and yet by 3 days after treatment, there was no herbicide found anywhere in that treatment zone. Conversely, Green Lake was only treating 1 acre, but they had that Limno-barrier curtain that prevented that herbicide movement. And you can see here that at 3 days after treatment, even though you're treating 1/50th of the area, we were still detecting quite a lot of herbicide. And so I think this really adds some evidence that these herbicide barriers can be a useful tool. We just have to figure out what sort of herbicide might be functional within these barriers to actually kill the Starry Stonewort. And then the Wind Lake plant data, a very similar graph that I've already shown you. And so in June, prior to treatment, there was about 10% littoral frequency of Starry Stonewort. After that first large-scale treatment occurred, the Starry Stonewort frequency actually increased to 15%. And subsequently, after the second treatment, Starry Stonewort also increased again to about 20%. So it does not seem that these treatments were very effective at reducing the amount of Starry Stonewort within this area. Part of this might just have to do, again, with the natural phenology of Starry Stonewort. It tends to be relatively sparse in June and increases in abundance as the season progresses. And then these rake fullness ratings as well, we didn't really see any decline in the overall abundance of Starry Stonewort. So not only did the frequency sort of increase, but the abundance seemed to follow a very similar pattern. So I'm going to transition to a couple other non-chemical management techniques. As you've maybe been able to synthesize from the first few case studies I've discussed, a lot of the chemical management we've utilized to date really hasn't been very successful in achieving our goals. And so we're more interested in trying to explore alternative and integrated management techniques to try to see if we can make some headway in understanding how to control this species. And so the case study that I'm going to talk about next is our water level drawdown, which was implemented on Little Muskego Lake. As you might remember, Little Muskego Lake was the first lake where we verified Starry Stonewort in Wisconsin. There was some efforts to do some initial dash and hand pulling soon after discovery, which was then followed up by a small scale combing crystal copper treatment. This copper treatment was not very successful in containing the Starry Stonewort. And based on our 2017 survey, which you can see over here on the right, Starry Stonewort had really escaped from this bay, and it was now found scattered all throughout the littoral zone of this lake. And so it was conceptualized that perhaps a water level drawdown would be an appropriate tool to use out here. Part of the background on why we thought a water level drawdown might work is based on some of the laboratory work that Dr. Ken Carroll and his colleagues have been doing at the New York Botanical Garden, funded through a DNR AIS research grant. And they had found some evidence that if you could dry and freeze these bulbils for more than a day or so, that could potentially be an effective control mechanism. And so we decided to try this out in the field. And our goal here was to conduct a water level drawdown of 7 feet. And so everything highlighted in this orange color here in this image was anticipated to be high and dry following this drawdown. And that also conveniently is where basically all the Starry Stonewort was located within this lake. We started the drawdown in September and it was concluded by mid-October. In general, it went well. The weather was ideal. The drawdown, functioned well. We were able to keep our pumps running. And we also, made a decision to close our fishery, which was accepted by the local stakeholders in the community. Just some kind of cool aerial photos of the drawdown being implemented. On the bottom here, we have the main public boat launch. Most of the Starry Stonewort is actually located in this kind of top right corner here. That's the Hillview Bay area. Here is a screenshot of that Hillview Bay boat launch, where most of Starry Stonewort was originally discovered. And so things were going well. And then we stopped the drawdown and Mother Nature had some different ideas in mind, I guess. So right after we hit our drawdown target rate, it just downpoured. There was a deluge of rain. We got some 3-inch rain events for multiple days in a row. And it was very difficult for us to keep that water level down where we wanted it to be. Ideally when we're doing a drawdown, the conditions that we're looking for is something like this photo on the right. It's dry sediment, it's cracks, it's very clear that this sediment is, not harboring moisture anymore. Unfortunately, what we saw in Little Muskego was this image here. You can see that the sediment is still very wet. There's, small pools of water that have formed. We actually noticed that there was a lot of groundwater discharge that was kind of coming back up and repooling the system. And so we really weren't able to achieve those ideal conditions that we were hoping for. Nonetheless, we went out and did our aquatic plant surveys, and we've done some basic statistical analysis of this data as well. And so I'll just focus here just on the pre and post drawdown information. The top line here for Starry Stonewort, unfortunately, our drawdown actually significantly increased Starry Stonewort. So very much not the management outcome we were hoping for. If there is a silver lining here, the Eurasian water milfoil, another non-native species, also significantly decreased. And so at least they got control of one of their invasive species in the lake, if not the one they were necessarily targeting. We did see some impacts to native plants the year following drawdown. I did not have time to insert our 2019 data here, but I took a quick peek at it yesterday. And a lot of these natives have recovered back to pretreatment levels. Unfortunately, the Starry Stonewort is also very similar in that it hasn't declined also. So I think my take home from this particular experience is that it's not to say a drawdown won't work for controlling Starry Stonewort. I think there's still a lot of promise here, but of course it needs to be implemented exactly and perfectly, and that can be very difficult to achieve when we're battling other variables such as rain events and precipitation. All right, and then the last case study or two, again, kind of moving away towards these more, away from chemical and more towards physical controls. We have a lake in, again, southeast Wisconsin where Starry Stonewort was discovered in 2015. This lake is also fortunate where they fell within that Great Lakes Basin boundary, and they were able to tap into some of that Great Lakes Restoration Initiative funding to help support some of this management and control and monitoring out here. Soon after discovery, there was a very extensive effort, primarily led by some of the county staff, to do some diver-assisted suction harvesting. They dedicated several days of work out here in the area where Starry Stonewort was known to be present in front of the boat launch. And they use these kind of biofiltering bags to take all that plant material, any inadvertent sediment that might have been collected during the dash process. And then we bagged these up and basically buried them, with permission. These are biodegradable bags in order to, again, not allow these bulbils and sediments to somehow get into another waterway. The dash seemed to have worked in really not allowing the Starry Stonewort to move outside of this area. In 2019, we started to see a couple satellite populations moving away from this main boat launch into a couple other areas of this first lobe of the lake. And so through much discussion with the lake group and with DNR staff, we decided to give dredging a try. And the idea here was that we were going to dredge down at least about 1.5 to 2 feet, with the idea that we were hopefully going to not only remove the plants above ground, but also remove some of those bulbils that might be present in that sediment water interface. And so this was a pretty extensive process. It took them, I believe, days, if not weeks, to complete this dredging in this area. Because this dredging happened in 2019, we don't really have a lot of information yet on how successful it was. But I just kind of snipped this graph out from that first image where I showed you, where you can see over time through the dash as well as the dredging, the amount of Starry Stonewort on Silver Lake has remained fairly low. Whether or not this is due to our actions or whether or not this is just Starry Stonewort, doing what it would normally do in terms of invasion, is somewhat left to be, distinguished. But it does seem like we are, perhaps making some efforts here and keeping this species contained and not allowing it to spread. And then another lake that did some hand pulling in dash was Little Cedar Lake in Washington County. Again, this is a relatively new lake that's implemented this technique. Starry Stonewort was first discovered in August of 2018. And again, they were able to tap into some of these GLRI funds to help support the monitoring and control efforts. The local lake association and some volunteers from the county and DNR immediately started doing some hand pulling soon after discovery. And then they coupled this with some a little bit more coordinated diver-assisted suction harvesting projects that were implemented in both August and September. Again, because this is a relatively new discovery and new management, there's not a lot of data to show here yet, but we do have a little bit of information in August before those dash events started in comparison to October. The amount of Starry Stonewort in terms of frequency, we really didn't see a decline there. It basically stayed about the same. Many of our native plants also were very similar. And then we looked also at that rake fullness rating. So again, that how abundant Starry Stonewort was. And there's some indication that perhaps our dash was able to reduce the abundance of Starry Stonewort, if not the frequency of it. But I think we'll really need some more data going out into 2020 and beyond to better understand how effective this diver assisted suction harvesting was at controlling Starry Stonewort in this area. And then finally, before I jump into my conclusions and take some questions, I leave kind of my favorite lake for last, and this is Pike Lake in Washington County. This is a lake that Starry Stonewort was discovered in August of 2015, and it does have a fairly active lake group, but they have chosen to basically not actively manage Starry Stonewort. They really don't manage much for invasive species. There's also Eurasian water milfoil on this lake, but they've learned that it doesn't really get to levels where management is very warranted. And so this serves as a pretty unique control scenario where we can monitor this lake over time to understand how Starry Stonewort, spreads and impacts other species without any active management occurring. And again, we've done our annual point intercept surveys out here to look at trends over time. And out of all the lakes we've monitored in Wisconsin to date, the one that we are not actively managing is the one lake where we're actually seeing Starry Stonewort decline over time. So perhaps a little bit counterintuitive to what we might think when we think about managing an invasive species. But I think this is really important and provides some context in understanding invasives just in general. We know that invasive species oftentimes hit a peak or some sort of threshold, and then, find somewhat of a medium or a carrying capacity, so to say, where it sort of, declines and sort of integrates back with the plant community. And over this 4-year period, there's some evidence that Starry Stonewort might be doing this. Not only has the frequency of Starry Stonewort kind of exhibited somewhat of a decline over time, but sort of the abundance as well. We're seeing a lot less, rake fullnesses of 2s and 3s, dense plants in recent years than we did in previous years. And so this is one that we're going to definitely continue to monitor over time. Because I don't think there are many of these lakes out there that aren't trying to actively manage the species. All right, and then just to summarize a little bit of kind of where we're at with all this information. So, the evaluation of our quantitative, pre-post treatment data from these lakes that have utilized some of these chemical control methods, primarily these copper-based herbicides mixed with hydrothol compounds. We really haven't seen, any control and certainly not eradication of Starry Stonewort. There is some indication that these use of these Limno-barrier curtains in conjunction with these chemical applications, it seems that they can certainly keep that herbicide on site for a longer period of time where we want it to be, but unfortunately, this didn't necessarily equate to better control of Starry Stonewort. The chemicals going into these barrier curtains still weren't able to do what we wanted them to do. The single implementation of a winter drawdown that we tried, again, really didn't result in control of Starry. It actually seemed to maybe have made it a little bit worse. But again, it needs to take in the caveat that the sediment never dried. And, I would definitely think that this could be a technique that could be tried again. Maybe on another system where a drawdown is possible. For our lakes that have tried dash or dredging to date, I showed a little bit of preliminary data, but really I think a lot of that information will be forthcoming in the next year or two, and we're going to continue to evaluate those techniques as well. We have 2 or 3 new lakes that I didn't talk about today that are looking into using dash also. And then the Wisconsin DNR is really working collaboratively with many different regional and national partners. Clearly, I'm here today as part of the Starry Stonewort Collaborative, and I think this is a great avenue to get information out to stakeholders. And we've also been working with some of our agencies, such as the Army Corps of Engineers and various universities as well, to help kind of evaluate and understand this new species. And so where we're going next, again, I think the take home is, prevention is key. And I know that, that gets said a lot, but, if we are able to prevent the spread of the species, that's going to be our most effective way to control it. Because once it gets in a lake, it seems that our current tools in our toolbox are very limited, and frankly, they're not being all that effective as well. We're going to continue to try to detect Starry Stonewort early. We still believe that, early detection and rapid response is a good strategy to try to implement on these systems. Assessing a population soon after it's discovered, making sure that it's actually verified by taxonomic experts, and then using that information to help guide, appropriate management. And again, that might be an experimental technique. If these management activities do occur, we want to make sure that we're working to really collect that quantitative data to assess, whether or not our time and effort and resources are working. Some of these management techniques certainly have non-target risks. Copper is an herbicide that does not really degrade. It tends to bind and accumulate in sediments. So, there's concerns about overuse of copper and toxicity to inverts and even native aquatic plants. So, again, we want to make sure that we're not doing more harm than good when we're managing the species. Engaging local stakeholders is critical. Almost all of our Starry Stonewort lakes have a Clean Boats, Clean Waters program to help educate people on Starry Stonewort and also, clearly prevent the spread of that species to other water bodies. And then, again, working with other states, I think we're going to have to certainly partner together and adaptively lean on each other to learn from successes and failures and try to figure out how we can manage the species moving forward. So with that, I'm done with the formal part of the presentation, and I'm more than willing to help hopefully answer some of your questions or provide clarity. And thanks a lot.
Thank you, Michelle. It was fantastic. Everybody, if you got questions, please use the chat box and I will read them. And then Michelle can, of course, work her magic and answer the questions. One question came in during the presentation. How many lakes does Wisconsin survey annually for aquatic invasive plants?
Yeah, good question. The Wisconsin DNR, I guess first answer, I don't have a quantitative number, but it's a lot. So the Wisconsin DNR, we have a pretty robust early detection and rapid response aquatic invasive species program. And we've actually just concluded a 5-year effort where we were aiming to target about 200 lakes each year to survey for invasive species. That study has now concluded, so we got up to 1,000 lakes where we've done at least one formal AIS survey on in the last 5 years. We're continuing to do those invasive species surveys on lakes, but it's a little bit more opportunistic. In terms of the aquatic plant point intercept surveys, again, that is oftentimes tied into like a aquatic plant management plan or a lake management plan. And so those are usually, they usually occur kind of on a 3 to 5 year basis that an aquatic plant survey will happen on a typical lake. We've made an effort with our Starry Stonewort lakes to go out and survey them annually, just because there's so much that isn't known about these species. And frankly, if we just went out and surveyed them every 5 years, we wouldn't be very far right now in our understanding. So, I think compared to other states, Wisconsin probably does more than others in terms of invasive species. And I'm not boasting or anything there, but we've had a pretty robust program for many years. And so, when Starry sort of came on our radar, we were able to kind of integrate it into existing programs that were already ongoing.
Fantastic. Let's see, Brian Ginn from Canada. He says, great presentation, Michelle, very interesting. Chris Jurek, thank you for presenting. This was great. Have you looked at any treatments just using diquat? If so, what type of results did you see?
Yeah, off the top of my head, I believe there was one lake that I did not present on today that tried to use diquat. Unfortunately, I don't think that they really collected any quantitative evaluation data, you know, on that specific diquat treatment area. But we do have that lake-wide data for that system, and we know from the lake-wide data that, you know, the Starry Stonewort continued to spread. We've been having some talks with the U.S. Army Corps, and I know that in their mesocosm studies, they looked at diquat, and they did not find that diquat was very effective, again, under a controlled lab study. But, you know, I think we need to be a little cautious about directly applying lab studies to the field. And I think it's something that could certainly be explored further, given that diquat's sort of a, you know, non-selective herbicide that hypothetically could maybe control this plant.
Thank you. Richard asked, is there a preferred water temperature range for Starry Stonewort?
Great question. To be honest, I don't know that off the top of my head. From the phenology data that I've seen, both coming out of Minnesota as well as, you know, kind of firsthand experiences from being out in lakes in Wisconsin, you know, if I went out today, which is, you know, June 9th, and tried to find Starry Stonewort, it's probably going to be pretty hard for me to find it. It tends to not have a lot of biomass at this point. However, if I went out in a month from now, I would find quite a lot of it. And it does seem to really want to peak in late summer, early fall. I'm not sure if that's directly correlated to water temperature, or if that's more of a, you know, maybe light regime. You know, perhaps if someone else on the collaborative knows that answer and can answer it better than I can, I'd certainly be interested in it. I've heard some anecdotal reports, and I think there's a little bit of literature from the 80s that it can also persist under the ice in certain scenarios. So, but yeah, that's something that I think maybe needs to still be explored further.
As a follow-up to the diquat discussion, Chris says the Minnesota DNR is working with Ryan Wersall on diquat studies in Lake Coronis, and hopefully we'll learn more soon.
Great. Yeah, I'd be interested in seeing that work for sure.
Question that gets at, I think, the difference between algae and plants. When does Starry Stonewort flower?
Yeah, so well, I guess in North America it doesn't, and it, you know, again, it's not a vascular plant. So if the question is when does it form these bulbils, these reproductive structures, it seems from my experiences that happens later in the season, again, as the plant gets more mature. You know, I know there's some real Cariaceae experts like Ken on the line. So, yeah, if Ken has a you know, better answer for this one. But in short, it doesn't flower, but it does form these bulbils. And I've seen, you know, like I mentioned earlier, these bulbils don't necessarily only form at the bottom of the plant. They form at those nodes where those branchlets also come out. So a single Starry Stonewort plant can produce multiple bulbils.
Okay, thank you. This question I've seen before, do other countries have successful solutions?
Not that I'm aware of. I guess I believe North America is maybe the only country where Starry Stonewort is non-native. I know that there have been efforts to talk with Cariaceae researchers in Europe to understand, some of those basic ecological questions on how it behaves in its native range. Like I mentioned earlier, although it's native in Europe and Asia, it's very uncommon in these areas. And so a lot of the efforts in those countries is actually to restore starry stonewort, not to control it. So, I'm not aware of any other countries or states that have really had much of a success story. And I'd certainly be interested in seeing any of that information if people are aware of that out there.
Back to dicot again, Brian Ginn, he touched on this on his presentation last month. They had marinas up in the Lake Simcoe in Ontario applied dicot to control Eurasian water milfoil. The dicot seemed to kill off the Eurasian water milfoil that was holding the starry stonewort at least in check, at least partly in check.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great observation. One thing I haven't had a lot of time to dive into yet is a lot of these lakes that have starry stonewort are doing active management for other invasive species and primarily for Eurasian water milfoil. And it's a bit anecdotal at this point, but the two lakes that we've seen starry stonewort increase most rapidly have also implemented large-scale Eurasian water milfoil herbicide treatments over the past 5 years. One of the lakes did a lake-wide fluoridone treatment, and the other one did a lake-wide 2,4-D and endothel combination for milfoil. I think the correlation causation, clearly has to be, taken into account here, but it's not surprising that, controlling one invasive species is going to give another invasive species an opportunity to maybe, take over that niche. Eurasian water milfoil is a canopy producing plant. And so if all of a sudden there's all this light that's hitting the bottom that wasn't before, that could certainly, allow starry stonewort to kind of, jumpstart and spread further.
And I believe that's what Brian discussed that in his presentation, that they knocked down the Eurasian milfoil, but then the starry stonewort just took right over,
Yeah, yeah.
A couple more questions because we're already at an hour here. Let's see here. Was there any impact on native plants before and after chemical treatments? Could it have impacted the competitiveness with starry stonewort after the application?
Yeah, great question. We do have a little bit of that native plant data. And again, I wasn't able to dive into a lot of that today. A lot of these products we're using are copper-based. And so copper-based products can clearly target other native Caris species, but also can have impacts on vascular plants. So, I think, again, teasing out whether or not starry stonewort is outcompeting the natives or whether or not our chemical treatments themselves are damaging natives. We'll have to look into that a little bit further, but that's definitely something that could be happening. Our management actions themselves are, so yes.
Okay. Have you found any relationships among infestation density and frequency and depth among Wisconsin lakes? For example, is there something special about Pike Lake, or should we consider simply stop management for starry stonewort?
Yeah, we haven't really done, I guess, a meta-analysis yet looking at, the infestation density and frequency and depth. I'm going to put a pitch in right now for the next upcoming webinar for the Starry Stonewort Collaborative. I believe someone from the Minnesota AIS Research Center is going to talk about a meta-analysis that they're doing right now, looking at lakes in Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Indiana. And I think that they would probably have that sample size now to start looking at that exact question. So it's something that we can certainly do with our data set moving forward.
Chris Jurek is a follow-on to that question. I think Pike Lake is an interesting example. We have two unmanaged lakes in northern Minnesota. Both have seen increases. Moose Lake had a triple over 2 years, and Lake Winnie increased by 15% over 2 years. When Coronis was unmanaged, it also increased approximately 15% over 2 years.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And I just should reemphasize that Pike Lake is a single example, and we can't assume that all other unmanaged Starry Stonewort lakes are going to follow that trend. There's certainly going to probably be other lakes out there where a different trend is seen. Another thing to mention with Pike is that that the first survey that we did out there after it was discovered, it was already at 40% frequency. And so there's a very good probability that Starry Stonewort was out on Pike Lake for, years potentially before we, verified and discovered it. So it's possible that it already did that exponential increase, and we just didn't have, that data set looking back to catch that. A very good point.
I think that wraps up the questions. Chris says, thanks, Michelle. Question about, will the PowerPoint be made available? Yes, it will. Will link to the recording also be sent out? Yes, that will be there too. I'll be sending, Facebook and the mass mailings I do. But I just put up the website, starrystonewort.org. There's a library there, and there's also kind of a video library, and we'll be populating both those two places with the proper format thing. So I think that's it. Thank you again, Michelle. This is wonderful. Thank you, everybody, for attending. And yes, we hope to have Dan Larkin or somebody else he's working with in the middle of July. I don't have a definitive time and date, but I'll get that out soon so everybody knows. But we're looking somewhere around the middle of the month, around the 15th. So we're really looking forward to that. Lots of thanks coming in, Michelle. So.
Great.
Nice
well, I appreciate the opportunity to share our experiences, and I'm looking forward to listening into the rest of the webinars. So.
Yes, absolutely. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Have a good day and enjoy the weather while we have it.
Take care. Stay safe, everyone.
Thanks, Michelle.